Well, it's finally time for me to look at one of my oldest suggestions. Yeah, even when starting out this show, it ended up on my radar quite a bit, and definitely got shouted at me from various forms of social media, and was easily one of the most repeated comments on that suggested MMO list page on my site that I should really get around to updating and or removing. What I didn't quite understand was how binary those suggestions were. Review this! It's a really fun game and more people need to hear about it. Or, review this! It's pure garbage and totally went pay to win. Rip it apart. For starters, one, neither of those reasons should be your method for getting something reviewed on this show. MMO Grinder isn't the fanboy megaphone of praise and or derision. And two, this back and forth was constant. It almost seemed to ebb and flow with the age of the game itself. I really wasn't going to bother with it until a raid leader Patreon finally dropped it into the suggestion box, concerned and confused about its current state as well. I can probably verify some of those claims now, until it's overtaken by another publisher. This is the MMO Grinder, and it's time to look at Allods Online. As I mentioned pre-title card, this episode was suggested by the oft-uncredited raid leader patron Dr. Ken. I say suggested, more like demanded, really. See, here's this totally not altered in any way 100% real screen cap of the message I got from him on Patreon. It was my duty and obligation, clearly. Developed by Russian developer Ostrom Nival, and published by Russian publisher Mail.ru Group, aka My.com, Allods is one of those games that's considered by many of its fans and detractors as the definitive free-to-play WoW clone. Before Rift went free-to-play. And this isn't even remotely an unfair comparison, as Allods seems almost dead set on doing things the Warcraft way, even if they do have their own spin on things. The publisher has changed hands quite a bit, so we'll be seeing how it does in the hands of Mail.ru Group or their baffling English moniker My.com, publishers of the upcoming Skyforge. Hope this publisher leapfrog won't be holding any dark clouds over this game. Here we've got another possible example for the ideal that aesthetics are far more important than graphics, as Allods actually looks quite pleasing and has a unified theme. Think World of Warcraft and WildStar's blend of fantasy and sci-fi. Hell, the Empire actually looks pretty interesting, with the various member races carrying over the same general look, to highlight their militaristic and industrial way of life. At the same time, few will say that the game is graphically intense, as texture work can be rather low resolution, characters are rather angular, and the world feels quite barren. But these, at least, work in the Empire's favor. The real shame of all this is that everything else serves to bring the game down in the looks department. There's generic spell effects, 2D textures hanging from characters that always end up facing the camera awkwardly, the same kind of 2D work for auras, and a lot of the enemies tend to be very generic mobs seen in many typical fantasy-styled MMOs. Surprisingly, though, there's some effort put into the details. Nothing major, mind you, but small touches like having arrows sticking out of a corpse killed by a scout add a bit of flavor to the proceedings. Then we get to animations, and good lord, the animations are that special level of terrible. They can be stiff yet jittery, often unintentionally hilarious, and they certainly don't do the game any favors. Special mention goes to the wonderfully absurd horses running animation, which, when paired with a yellow yarn ball, more on that in gameplay, looks like an excitable puppy shoehorned into a massive steed. Like many animated films of the past decade, come to think of it. You can also see the lack of forethought in animations of the various interactions for each race, and while it is interesting that each race has its own unique animation for interacting with objects, it gets used for everything. Expect to see your Zataganian working an invisible lever up and down while they're pruning bushes, or the Arisen needlessly twirling their finger in the air as they open a steam valve. There's at least some humor to be found in these goofy animations, as Grindstone member Dreskar put on the hamster dance song while running around as an Arisen, which was met by snickering bursts of laughter as the two synced up surprisingly well. Try it out yourself sometime. Well, again with this whole thing, before you do anything in the game, turn down your speakers or take your headphones off, as the game starts absurdly loud, and can only be adjusted once you get into the tutorial itself. Why so many games do this is beyond me. Let us adjust things that can do damage to our ears before we get in-game if you're gonna bombard us with sound beforehand. As the music is concerned, we're actually rather impressed. It's not some amazing, memorable musical score or anything, but the tracks are very atmospheric and moving, lending a good backing to the gameplay on screen. There are some unfortunates, and with the game being a very slow burner, some tracks tend to be very slow, melancholy, and eerie, and has that unfortunate effect of making you feel like more of the grind is setting in. In general, though, it's a very competently done musical score and has its moment of brilliance. Sound, on the other hand, is more or less very generic, which can make combat feel even more drawn out than before. Everything just seems to be stock sound effects, and while there's little touches here and there that stand out, like the satisfying thump of an arrow hitting a target, in general the sound is very lacking. If you're looking for voice acting in the game, sporadically it has it, in Russian in some places, especially when you choose the option for voice-acted emotes, which has an added benefit of giving you your warning commands like inventory is full or out of range in Russian. Otherwise, besides some decent but ultimately forgettable music, and well-placed but still very stock sound effects, this pretty much covers it. After installing and meeting with a launcher that looks like it belongs in one of those clickbait-style RPGs you'll see on Facebook, you'll end up selecting your faction, either choosing the nature-loving, though slightly evil league that consists of the human Conians, the elves, and the 3 fuzzy bear gibberlings, whom I find the most amusing in that those 3 creatures are your one character, and you can customize them individually. Points for creativity there. Alternatively, you can sign with a communistic, industrialized empire made up of the human Zataganian, the totally not Warhammer 40k Necrons known as the Arisen, and the Orcs. You can also choose a newly added 7th race called the Pryden, who function exactly like the Pandaren in World of Warcraft because Allods was feeling left out of Mists of Pandaria, and they needed a few more clone notches in their belt. That last statement will get repeated a bit, as the game is a shameless WoW clone in every sense of the word, but not extending what mechanics of vanilla WoW made it interesting. Once you've chosen your faction and race, you can select which class you'd like to play as, though be warned that not every race can be any class, so choose accordingly. The classes have various names depending on the race that you choose, but they'll all follow a very specific mold. Healers, mages, paladins, mentalists, scouts, summoners, wardens, warriors, bards, and engineers. Do note that you aren't really told how to properly play each class, and each one has its own gimmick. Our general feelings were very mixed on how good each class is, so feel free to thumb through them to find a suitable class for your playstyle. The character creator itself is a decent variety, especially in terms of character height and build, but don't be surprised if you see a clone of yourself walking about. You can also choose to show starter armor, mid-tier armor, or endgame armor to see what your character will progress into, and choose to hide the helmet as well while you edit. We should note that Grindstone played on the Empire side of the game, so our perspective will be mostly from their point of view. When you finish customizing your character, you'll be placed into the opening tutorial. We should make note that this tutorial is not representative of the rest of the game. For the Empire, the astral ship that you start on is being boarded by the opposing faction, requiring you to repel the invaders and watch as the ship is pummeled by cannon fire. It's decently paced and introduces the mechanics, just not all that well, and shows off the exciting prospect of having your guild command your own astral ship, but we'll get into that later. Once it's over, you'll awaken in an Imperial hospital complex and be tasked with simple quests to show you have fully recovered from your ordeal. Here you'll have your knowledge of the combat and general MMO mechanics tested much further to make sure that you're prepared to enter the game world proper. This is where, yet again, with a few exceptions we'll cover shortly, the combat is very stiff and straight up WoW clone-like. The only exception to this comes mostly in the ranged characters and spell users, as ranged engagements taking place at much further distances usually seen in MMOs, and casters are able to store their spells for instant cast without needing to have an enemy targeted. That only serves as well as an opener though, and then mages are right back into turret mode. Once finished with the hospital, you'll be given a ticket to travel to Nezebgrad, a city that you'll get very familiar with because it never seems to end. This leads to 2 major problems with the questing. Not only will you get lots of quests that follow a very generic mold, but the quests from the same area will lead you all over the city, making most of your time spent running around that city to get your next quest. There's an auto-pathing feature that can alleviate the issue. However, this magical yarn ball is rather temperamental, sending you to odd corners of the areas and following a very awkward path. You can also be attacked while following the yarn ball, though it seems at low level the enemies will reset after being aggroed, but later on they'll continue to attack you. While it doesn't seem like much, consider that until level 12 you'll only be seeing this one city, which doesn't help alleviate the feeling of tedium from constantly running back and forth for questing. This is where you'll begin seeing that the quest design is rather generic and classic. Given that Allods is the definition of cloning vanilla WoW, it falls into the same ruts. Kill X. Kill X to gather Y. Gather Y to use on X. Use X to spread communist propaganda to Y bushes. Wait, what? Ah, yes, while some could say it's a rather cute play on words that you'll plant bugs in bushes by using actual insects instead of some sort of listening device, in a game that comes across as this much of a slog, it just adds this weird oddity to the grind. Speaking of grind, this seems to be a thing that changed from the past, as several former players noticed that the experience gain seems to have been hard nerfed, and none of them remember having half of their gained experience locked behind a paywall. You can bet that we'll be talking about that in the cash shop section. There's a bit of reprieve to be found with the Marks of Fate system, though, allowing you to spend marks to complete quests instantly, rather than having to, say, kill 50 enemies. But oddly, they don't allow marks to be used on all the quests, and it gets to feel rather arbitrary rather than helpful. I do find a certain hilarious charm in the Marks of Fate system, like I'm just paying people off to do their quests. It's like, hey, I need you to find me 50 wolf pelts, and I'm like, oh, you need 50 wolf pelts, huh? Let me see them right about, here's your wolf pelts. This pace slows down heavily as you progress through levels, and as some Grindstone members noted, can actually hinder your class identity, as some classes don't really come into their own until much later. If you wanted to be a healer, don't expect to actually perform that function well until around level 20 when you finally get a second healing ability. This does lead us into the interesting leveling system itself. At first, it seems to follow the usual skill tree mold, though not as simply, but it offers access to 3 specialization grids at level 10 that allow you to begin spending points to really make the class your own. You'll also see some unique ideas within the crafting system, but that isn't always a good thing. The crafting here falls into the usual rut for most MMOs, and it's generally useless outside of getting some more experience to help you ease the grind. If you do want to get into crafting, you'll find an NPC that'll give you a quest to meet each of the crafting proficiency NPCs and direct you to the tower at the center of Nezibgrad. To begin, you'll need to first learn the craft, accomplished by buying a proficiency book from the crafting NPC. You'll then need to purchase the crafting benches, starting with the novice gear, and then buying upgrade tools to help ease with the crafting. We cannot stress enough how vital the tools are for easing the randomness of this crafting. See, rather than straight crafting a la WoW or Rift, or the likes of having an in-depth minigame like in EverQuest 2, you'll instead play a completely random stamping minigame to get better quality items. The tools ease the randomness by allowing you to lock in tiles, bars, and swatches that you want to keep before re-rolling. It's like a slot machine without the flash or excitement. Think more like a crafting version of the game Yahtzee. If you don't get a match 5, you won't get that quality. So why are we talking about the game being too much of a clone of vanilla WoW, with many arguing that vanilla WoW would feel better than the current WoW model, and using that as a negative? Well, simply put, we've seen all this done before, time and time again, with more interesting ideas and executions put into it. With a hard nerf to experience gains put into the fold, and the same generic quest design that we've seen far better in other WoW clones, the game gets dragged down into pure tedium. There'll be no doubt that some people in the comments will be noting how low level my character is in this review, but we honestly tried, and only a single member of Grindstone managed to push past level 30, specifically to try to get us an astral ship to test out. That plan has since been abandoned, as it turns out you need to be far higher than just level 35 to get a ship. There's some unique ideas here, but they don't seem to be thought through very well, and tend to add yet more convoluted layers on top of the design. It also doesn't help that the game has been dumped from one publisher to the next, with each time changing the game fundamentally for the worse. You'd be surprised how many times requests for Allods would come in and then get cancelled because the publisher change allegedly would ruin the game. And then they'd come back in because the new publisher fixed things, and then another publisher takes over and that cycle continues. So if requests are that up and down, does anyone still even play this game? One thing you'll end up noticing immediately when starting out is that the game feels like abandonware. The chats here are very eerily silent, save for a random outburst here and there, usually in different languages considering there's only one server and hosts pretty much every country. You're unlikely to find many players running around the starting area of the game. Hell, we almost assumed that the game had no one playing but us for the longest time until we ran into a few max level players just idling about, and a couple of new players following around their yarn balls. We should note that we are playing on the free server, and from what we've heard, this is the most active server in the game, while the subscriber server is even more of a barren wasteland. It's a pity, as the subscriber server alleviates a lot of the past and future stated problems we have with this game, massively boosting XP gain, removing the rune system, and scaling mobs to be simpler to fight. The only trade-off is that you have to pay for it, and no one is there. If you thought Black Gold was empty, then you haven't seen anything until you play Allods. With such a small community left, you might be thinking that getting any group content done would be a nightmare. Well, not really surprisingly. Whether because of waning interest in the game, or just wanting to allow lone wolves to experience the dungeon content, you can now hire mercenaries to assist you in dungeons. It should be noted that mercenaries only work for group content, and not all group content, so don't expect to have the mercs assist you on a group boss, but feel free to use them to completely wreck those dungeons. That last part is not an understatement, as the mercenaries are so powerful you can use them to clear the dungeons without you having to do a single thing. If you want to get together with your friends, you could set up a guild within the game which does offer some benefits to its members. To do this, you need to purchase a Crystal of Unity for 1 gold, and then make sure you have 6 members online at the exact same time and in the same party. Once you have that, go to the Guildmaster with your party and use the crystal to start the guild. The person using the crystal will become the guild leader, but this can be changed later. To unlock the progression system for the guild and allow access to future buffs for your members, you'll need to buy a second item that costs 19 gold. However, be warned that as your prestige level increases, you'll need to buy more of those items at increasing gold values. Once the progression is unlocked, your guild members can perform guild missions each day to earn the experience for themselves and for the guild as a whole. Each member will have a loyalty ranking within the guild, starting at 10 and going up to a maximum of 100 that'll scale the amount of prestige said member brings to the guild by completing loyalty missions. As the guild levels up, then the guild leader can then spend points on a similar skill tile set as any character normally would when leveling up, with these guild buffs allowing for increased experience gains and useful benefits for its members. Those benefits might come into their own in the PvP, which, while the community is small, you'll still find a few people running around the PvE areas trying to kill members of the opposing faction. Here the mechanics of combat really hamper the fighting, as moving for any reason cancels casting, and your character rarely turns to face the target, so flanking is really easy to accomplish. You'll also have an issue that you can still be pulled into the PvP without needing to flag if you happen to attack mobs labeled with the other faction's name, so League blanks and Empire blanks, but most of the time you should get lucky and no one should be around while you quest fighting those mobs. The real shame of it, though, is that the enemy can actually force you into PvP by using a randomly dropping item known as the War Flag, which will automatically flag you as killable if you're within a certain level range of the flag wielder. There's even a structured, and I use that term loosely, PvP system. It's a large area with capturable points. The system used here is well-meaning. High-level players cannot capture points in lower-level spawn areas. But the problem stems from the fact that any appropriately leveled player can be escorted by a high level, taking out any opposition and letting that low-level player cap it without resistance. The subsequent and larger problem stems from the fact that no high-level player can reclaim that point, so if no lobies are in the area, that point remains uncapturable, and a staging point for enemy factions to farm anyone just arriving into the zone. Not that your level is the only thing making a huge difference in PvP. So what really makes PvP so capable of mental anguish? Well, we'll be getting into that in our next category. Yeah, it's one of those games. Where do we even begin with this cash shop? You think me wearing that "That's It Cash Shop Time" t-shirt of mine was a coincidence? This is one of those shops that's so poorly designed and so full of bad ideas that it could be used as a demonstration piece. Firstly, we have the always wonderful idea that you aren't allowed to see the exchange rate for your money until you're at the confirmation page. Allods isn't the only game to do this, but it's just the tip of the iceberg here, so to speak. As for the exchange rate itself, expect to pay 1.1 cents per gem, with an exception to the PaySafe card, which seems to use a different pay scale. Now, you can exchange gold for gems, but the rate is so skewed that it isn't even viable to consider, usually going for about 160 gold to 1 gem. The next aspect of the cash shop is its reliance on manipulative business practices to gain sales, starting with announcements of lottery boxes to everyone playing, in an effort to convince people to buy more lucky boxes. After all, you could totally be that big winner, why not buy a box, or 2, or 7, and try your luck? Hey, then maybe you could afford all the gold to the gem exchange rate and not have to pay the game any real money to... Oh, wait. We also have the frustrating aspect of paying in order to make progress within the game, as somewhere along the lines of the developers decide to take away half of your experience gains and lock them behind a paywall. None of the members of Grindstone who played this game years ago remember this cheap money grab. Once you hit around level 27 and realize you have hundreds of thousands of XP locked up with no more quests to do, the message becomes clear: pay or grind. And if that wasn't enough, we have cursed items within the game as well, which are items that could be better than the gear you currently have on, but have a massive debuff or a curse placed upon them, and they'll need to be cleansed. So how do you go about cleansing them? If you said fork over some real money to buy an item from the cash shop, you would be correct. Of course, one of the most annoying examples rears its ugly head as well, as the game is without a doubt a pay-to-win. If you want an advantage that only paying players can have at any decent pace, feel free to buy some runes for your character, which will give you percentage-based buffs to your attack and defense for your items. As you can imagine, in a game where you can be forced into PvP, this is just a pile of pain and adds insult to injury. Finally, the game has added a new feature. Pay them around $60 to advance all the way to level 60 with a full set of runes, just like in World of Warcraft. What is it with these developers and insisting that they need the copy that everything WoW does, except for all the modifications in gameplay and pacing that it had over the decade of its life? This is taking commitment to being a WoW clone to a whole new and very disturbing level. Yeah, our enthusiasm burnt out pretty fast with this game, and whether it's a victim of timing, circumstance, or the game's classic and simplistic design, or simply the fault of another publisher change, it wasn't something I enjoyed very much. It's sad because aesthetically I wanted to like this. The promise of Astral Ship seemed really fun. The art design was pretty nice, and I really liked the look and potential of all the characters, but the game refused to click with me. And frankly, there's plenty of games that do what this game does, so you're not exactly tapped for similar choices. Here's my final rating. If you miss the old-style World of Warcraft games, without having to pay for World of Warcraft or hunt down a sketchy private server, this is a pretty decent alternative. It's got a classic feeling that seems very reminiscent of the original World of Warcraft style in questing and gameplay. In fact, the aesthetic matches very well, being semi-industrialized high fantasy, and the graphics hold up pretty well for their stylistic choices. The biggest draw might be the hardest to reach, but there's real promise in the Astral Ship combat system, and some might be interested in the game for this aspect alone. This game has no shortage of things to pay for, but a subscription seems like the best bet across the board, even if you might be pretty lonely on that server. Otherwise, be prepared to have to fork over the cash to avoid the grind walls by unlocking all of that stored XP. Of course, you could always just bypass all of that and get to those sweet Astral Ships early for the low price of $60, so if you're someone that thinks MMOs are only about the endgame, this option was made for you. Have you played an MMO? You've probably played something like this, be it WoW or its many clones. If you're used to the basics of target and click, kill X to gather Y, talent trees, and several other Warcraftian tropes, then there's not much that'll feel new in Allods. Of course, the biggest issue stems from its cash shop and its different pay-to-win options. Those of you who are in debate as to whether or not this game could be considered pay-to-win, keep in mind that upgrading the runes with cash shop chips can grant you anywhere from a 70 to upwards of over 100% power increase over other players of the exact same level. Also consider the game will lock you behind a painfully slow grind wall unless you're willing to free some of that trapped experience. Otherwise, you're trapped in very slow-feeling progression, moving from quest to quest in the same small area until you've exhausted all possible things to do just to move ahead a level or two. Of course, if you play MMOs for the often exaggerated promise of hundreds of people online at once, divide that by about 20 and you'll be closer to the amount of people you're likely to see in any given area. Unless you bring some friends along to keep you company, you might feel pretty alone here. Next time, we're taking a look at something completely different, with a game that takes a much more comedic approach to the genre. Hey, thanks for sticking around for this thing. Care to see what I thought about the Elder Scrolls Online? You can click that window on the left, and if you want to see what I thought about the beta a year prior, the window on the right will take you to my side quest video on it, featuring a couple of guest opinions as well. If you like this show enough, even after this debacle, you can see more by visiting my website and get notified when new eps are out by subscribing. which I'm guessing most of you had figured out by now, but hey, YouTube tradition or some shit. I've also got Twitter accounts, and I've been caught saying Patreon a few times in these videos. Links are here and in the description. Shoutouts for those that support me haven't changed from last week. It's like people don't want any reciprocation for supporting me or something. Slipstream's stream channel remains at twitch.tv/slipstreamx14, and he's looking to work on his own game in the far future. I'm sure I'll be plugging that in time. Michael Foy remains a fan of Ross Fairies and his site, paradiseandfairies.com, even after my stupid ass appeared in 2 of his videos to yell at breasts or something. Senran Kagura is a weird game. $7? Oh, wait, this is like 15. Who actually carries all the money that they own in their wallet in cash anyway? I mean, banks exist, don't they?